The sky above the barren landscape was thick with clouds of ash and smoke, the remnants of a long and devastating war. The ground, once teeming with life, was now a desolate wasteland, littered with the wreckage of fallen starships and the bodies of those who had perished in the conflict. Among the debris, a lone figure lay motionless, his once powerful body now broken and weak. Krav, genetically engineered war dog, had served the Orcs Empire for years, leading his pack into countless battles with ferocity and precision. His purpose was clear: to obey, to fight, and to conquer. But now, abandoned and forgotten, Krav's purpose had been stripped from him, leaving only pain and confusion. He had been left behind, a casualty of a war that had ended in an uneasy truce. His masters had no need for him anymore. As the victorious parties withdrew and the galaxy moved on, Krav was discarded like a broken weapon, no longer of any use. His once shining fur was matted with grime, his powerful muscles weakened by starvation, and his nano-enhanced senses flickered in and out of focus. The battlefield had been his home, but now it felt like his grave. Struggling to stand, Krav let out a low, pitiful growl as he collapsed back onto the ground. His body screamed in agony, every movement sending sharp jolts of pain through his limbs. He had fought through worse injuries before, but this time felt different. This time, there was no pack to rally behind him, no master to give him orders. He was alone. As his vision blurred and darkened at the edges, Krav's mind wandered to memories of the past. He remembered the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of a successful mission, the rare moments when his masters praised his performance. But those memories now felt distant, like echoes of a life that no longer belonged to him. He had given everything to the Orcs, his loyalty, his strength, his very identity, and in return, they had left him to die. With one last, shuddering breath, Krav's body went still. The harsh reality of his situation weighed heavily on him. He had been bred for war, designed to fight and kill, but now all he could do was wait for the inevitable, his slow, painful demise on this forgotten planet. But as Krav lay there, awaiting death's cold embrace, a faint glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. The human exploration vessel, the Odyssey, glided silently through the empty space above the ravaged planet. Its sleek hull shimmered under the faint light of distant stars, a stark contrast to the destruction below. Inside, Commander Jace Harper stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the data streaming across the ship's console. The war had been over for years, but the scars it left behind were still fresh on many of the planets they now explored. X-13 was one of those planets, once a lush world, now a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams. "Sir," came a voice from the comm station, breaking the tense silence. "We're picking up something on the surface. It's faint, but it's definitely a life sign." Jace frowned, intrigued. "A life sign? Here." He stepped closer to the console, studying the readings. The scanners confirmed it. Weak but unmistakable pulse of life amidst the devastation. "Bring us in closer," he ordered, his curiosity piqued. "I want to see what could have survived down there." The Odyssey descended through the thick atmosphere, the once blue sky now marred by clouds of dust and ash. As the ship approached the surface, the true scale of the destruction became clear. Broken starships lay scattered across the landscape like bones of ancient beasts, and the ground was littered with the remnants of a war long forgotten. Yet amidst this desolation, one tiny blip on the scanner persisted. "Prepare a landing party," Jace instructed, his voice steady, "and inform Dr. Claire Reynolds. If something's alive down there, we might need her." A few minutes later, the landing party, led by Jace and accompanied by Dr. Reynolds, set foot on the surface of X-13. Their boots crunched over the scorched ground as they made their way through the debris, following the signal that pulsed weakly on their handheld scanners. Weapons at the ready, they moved cautiously through the eerie silence. In a place like this, danger could be lurking around every corner. After what felt like an eternity of walking through the wreckage, they finally found the source of the life sign. The team stopped dead in their tracks at the sight before them. Lying in a shallow crater, surrounded by broken machinery and twisted metal, was a massive creature. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, and its once mighty frame was now gaunt and fragile. The creature's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and its eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now dull and unfocused. What is that?" one of the soldiers whispered, taking a step back. Jace recognized it immediately. "It's a var," he said quietly. "One of the Zorks' war dogs." The var, genetically engineered for combat, was one of the deadliest creations to come out of the war. They had been relentless in their pursuit of human forces, often leading entire packs into battle with terrifying efficiency. Jace had seen firsthand the damage they could do. Many good soldiers had fallen to these creatures, their bodies torn apart by the var's powerful jaws and claws. And yet, as Jace looked down at the pitiful form lying before him, he felt an unexpected pang of pity. This creature, once so fierce and deadly, was now little more than a shadow of its former self. Abandoned, just like the planet it had been left to die on. Dr. Claire Reynolds knelt beside the creature, her scanner already whirring in her hand. "It's barely alive," she murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of fascination and concern. "Severe malnutrition, internal bleeding. It's a miracle it's still breathing. We should put it out of its misery," one of the soldiers said, his hand tightening on his rifle. "That thing's a monster. You saw what they did to our troops." "No," Claire replied sharply, her eyes never leaving the var. "It's not a monster, not anymore. Look at it. It's just another casualty of this war. And I'm not about to let it die if we can help it." Jace hesitated. The logical part of him agreed with the soldier. The var had been their enemy, a ruthless predator bred to kill without mercy. But something about this situation felt different. The war was over, and this creature was no longer a threat. In fact, it was as much a victim as any soldier who had fought in the conflict. With a heavy sigh, Jace nodded. "Do what you can for it, Doc. But keep it quiet. The Zorks can't know we've got one of their war dogs." As Claire and her team worked to stabilize the creature, Crab's mind drifted in and out of consciousness. His body was too weak to respond, but somewhere in the fog of pain, he registered the presence of the humans, the same beings he had been bred to destroy. He should have been filled with rage, with a primal instinct to fight. But all he felt was exhaustion. And as he slipped back into darkness, he could have sworn he felt a gentle hand on his side, offering a glimmer of warmth in the cold emptiness. The sterile white walls of the Odyssee's medical bay were a stark contrast to the devastation Krav had known on the battlefield. The soft hum of machinery surrounded him, and every now and then, the quiet beep of monitors pierced through the fog of his consciousness. Krav's body lay motionless on the operating table, surrounded by the humans who had brought him aboard. His mind, however, was a storm of confusion and pain. In his weakened state, Krav could barely make sense of what was happening. Faint memories of his capture flickered in and out. Humans, the very enemy he had been trained to destroy, touching him, helping him. His instincts screamed at him to fight, but his body no longer obeyed his commands. He was broken, both physically and mentally. "Vitals are stabilizing," Dr. Claire Reynolds said as she adjusted the monitor beside Crab's bed. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of exhaustion. She had been working for hours, trying to repair the damage caused by years of abandonment and neglect. "He's still in rough shape, but we've stopped the internal bleeding. Now it's just a matter of keeping him alive long enough to heal." Commander Jace Harper stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed as he watched the massive creature lying before them. It was hard to believe that this was the same beast that had torn through their forces during the war. The same species that had been responsible for the deaths of so many human soldiers. And yet, here it was, defenseless and vulnerable. "I never thought I'd see one of these up close," Jace said quietly, his eyes scanning the Var's massive frame. They were always so quick on the battlefield. We never had a chance to get this close before. Claire glanced up from her work, her expression serious. They were bred for war, just like us, she replied. But look at him now. He's not a monster. He's a victim of the same violence we all suffered through. If we let him die, we're no better than the ones who created him. Jace sighed, running a hand through his hair. He respected Claire's compassion, but he couldn't shake the unease he felt around the creature. The Var had been engineered to be perfect killing machines, designed by the Zorks to obey without question and destroy without hesitation. Could they really trust something like that? What do we do with him if he survives? Jace asked, his tone laced with concern. The Zorks can't know we have one of their war dogs. If they find out, it could reignite tensions. We just got out of that war. Claire looked down at Krav, her expression softening. I don't know, she admitted. But I do know that he deserves a chance, just like any soldier who's been through hell. We can't just treat him like a weapon. He's more than that. He has to be. Krav's consciousness flickered, and for a moment, his vision cleared. He could see the humans standing over him. One male, one female. They weren't like the Zorks. The Zorks had been cold, distant, giving orders with no concern for their creations. These humans were different. There was something, kind in the way they spoke, in the way they moved around him. It was strange, and Krav didn't know what to make of it. Pain surged through his body again, and Krav let out a low growl, his instincts momentarily flaring to life. The human stepped back, startled, but Claire quickly moved to his side, placing a gentle hand on his fur. Her touch was soft, and though Krav didn't understand the words she spoke, the tone was soothing. It wasn't the harsh commands of the Zorks. It was something else, something that felt safe. Shh, it's okay, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady beeping of the monitors. You're safe now. We're not going to hurt you. Krav's growl subsided, his body too weak to resist any further. Exhaustion overtook him once more, and he slipped back into the darkness, his mind swirling with confusion. These humans, they weren't his enemy anymore. But could he really trust them? Could he trust anyone? Days passed, and slowly but surely, Krav's condition began to improve. His wounds healed, and his strength started to return, though he was still far from the powerful creature he had once been. He could feel the humans watching him, studying him, but there was no malice in their actions. They brought him food, tended to his injuries, and spoke to him in calm, quiet voices. For the first time in his life, Krav was experiencing something he had never known: care. As the days turned into weeks, Krav's recovery continued. He began to move again, his body regaining its strength little by little. The humans had even built him a larger space to rest, allowing him the room he needed to stretch and walk. They still kept their distance, wary of the potential danger he posed, but they were no longer afraid of him. And Krav, though still confused by his new reality, found himself oddly grateful. These humans, the same species he had once hunted and fought against, were now his saviors. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, but it was real. Krav's recovery continued at a steady pace. Each day, he found himself regaining more of his strength, his wounds healing under the careful watch of Dr. Claire Reynolds and her team. But as his body mended, a new kind of struggle began to take root within him. Battle between instinct and reason. His instincts told him not to trust these humans. They were the enemy, the very species he had been trained to hunt, to destroy. The Zorks had drilled it into his mind. Humans were weak, unworthy of mercy. They had been the ones responsible for the war, and Krav's purpose had been to fight against them, to protect the Zorks' empire. But these humans were different from what he had been taught. Claire, in particular, was a constant presence. She spoke to him in a soft, calming voice whenever she checked his vitals or changed his bandages. Krav didn't understand the words, but the tone was soothing, unlike the sharp commands the Zorks had always barked at him. Claire's hands were gentle, and though she always maintained a respectful distance, she was never afraid. There was no fear in her eyes, only concern. It was a confusing realization for Krav. The humans were supposed to fear him, to hate him, just as he had been taught to fear and hate them. But there was none of that here. One evening, as the crew of the Odyssey prepared for another long night in space, Jace Harper stood in the doorway of the medbay, watching as Claire finished her check on Krav. The war dog was growing stronger by the day, his once dull eyes now sharp and alert. He had even begun to walk again, albeit slowly, his large frame still weak from his injuries. "He's doing better than I expected," Claire said, standing up and turning to Jace. "His resilience is incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Jace nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "He's a var, Claire. They were bred to be nearly indestructible. But that's also what worries me." Claire tilted her head, sensing Jace's hesitation. "You're still afraid of him." "I'm not afraid," Jace replied, crossing his arms. "But I am cautious. We don't know what he'll do once he's fully recovered." The var were engineered to follow orders. Zork's orders. What happens if his instincts take over? Claire looked back at Krav, who lay resting on the medbay floor, his breathing steady. She understood Jace's concerns. The var had been created to be weapons, tools of war. But what she saw in Krav was something more. He wasn't just a machine designed to kill. There was something deeper there, something that the Zorks had never bothered to see. "I don't think he's just following orders anymore," Claire said after a moment. "There's something different about him. He's learning, adapting. We just need to give him a chance to understand that we're not his enemies." Jace raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "And what if you're wrong? What if one day he snaps, and we have a fully recovered war dog tearing through this ship?" Claire didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, she didn't know what would happen once Krav regained his full strength. But something in her gut told her that Krav was more than just a weapon. He had been abandoned, left to die by the very beings who had created him. And now, for the first time, he was experiencing something other than the cold commands of war. He was experiencing care. As the days passed, Krav began to interact more with the crew, albeit cautiously. His strength returned, and soon he was able to walk without assistance, his powerful legs carrying him through the corridors of the Odyssey. The humans gave him space, watching him from a distance as he explored his new environment. There were moments when Krav's instincts flared, moments when he felt the urge to lash out, to remind the humans of the danger he posed. But every time, he held back. There was a part of him, a small but growing part, that didn't want to harm them. He remembered the gentle touch of Claire's hand, the way she had spoken to him softly, without fear or malice. It was a new sensation for Krav, one he didn't fully understand but didn't want to lose. But not everyone on the Odyssey was as trusting as Claire. Sergeant Victor Mason, one of the ship's security officers, had made his feelings about Krav clear from the beginning. He didn't trust the var, and he wasn't shy about expressing it. "I don't care how tame he seems now," Mason said one day, standing in the mess hall with Jace. "That thing is a killing machine. The only reason it's not attacking us is because it's too weak. But once it's fully healed, you're putting this entire crew at risk." Jace, ever the diplomat, tried to reassure his officer. "I get it, Mason. Believe me, I do. But Claire's convinced that Krav's different. And until he gives us a reason to believe otherwise, we're going to treat him like any other recovering soldier." Mason scoffed. "Soldier? That thing's not a soldier. It's a weapon. And it's only a matter of time before it turns on us." Jace didn't reply, but Mason's words lingered in his mind. He had his own reservations about Krav's presence on the ship, but he also trusted Claire's judgment. She had seen something in the var that he hadn't, something that gave her hope. And for now, that was enough. Crab's mind continued to wrestle with the growing bond he felt with the humans. It was confusing. How could he, a war dog bred for destruction, feel anything other than hatred for them? But every day that passed, every interaction he had with Claire, with Jace, with the crew, chipped away at the walls the Orcs had built in his mind. The humans weren't his enemy anymore. In fact, they were something he had never known, his saviors. Crab's days aboard the Odyssey had settled into a routine. His strength had mostly returned, and his once fragile, broken body was now nearly as powerful as it had been during the war. But something was different this time. He no longer felt the burning desire to kill, to obey the Orcs' commands that had once driven him forward. Instead, he found himself observing the humans, studying them, learning from them. They were strange creatures, so fragile and yet resilient. They treated him with a mixture of caution and curiosity, though most kept their distance. Claire, of course, was the exception. She continued to check on him daily, speaking to him softly and patiently, always watching his progress. It was through her that Krav began to understand the concept of kindness, something entirely foreign to him. But despite the tentative peace that had formed between Krav and the humans, there was an undercurrent of tension that rippled through the ship. Not everyone trusted him, and Krav could feel the eyes of certain crew members watching his every move, waiting for him to slip, to reveal the killer they believed still lurked beneath the surface. Sergeant Victor Mason was the loudest voice of dissent. His distrust of Krav had only grown with time, and he made no effort to hide it. Every interaction between Krav and the crew was scrutinized, every moment of Krav's recovery treated with suspicion. "You're playing with fire, Commander," Mason said one evening during a briefing with Jace and Claire. "This thing," he gestured toward the medbay where Krav was resting, "is a war machine. It's been engineered to kill. You think it's just going to forget that?" "He's not an it, Mason," Claire interjected, her tone sharp. "He's a living being, just like any of us. And he's recovering. You don't know him like I do." Mason scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You're too close to this, Doc. I'm telling you, it's only a matter of time before that thing snaps. You want to treat him like a wounded animal, but you're forgetting he was designed for one thing: war." Jace, ever the diplomat, raised his hand, silencing the brewing argument. "Enough. I get both of your concerns, but Mason, Claire's right. Krav hasn't given us any reason to believe he's a threat, yet." He emphasized the last word, his gaze shifting to Claire. "We need to be careful. We're in uncharted territory here. If we're wrong about him, the consequences could be disastrous." Claire said nothing, but the look of determination in her eyes didn't falter. She believed in Krav, even if no one else did. To her, he wasn't just a weapon. He was a living, breathing creature, capable of change. But could he truly escape his past? One night, as the Odyssey sailed through the quiet expanse of space, Krav found himself pacing restlessly in the small cargo bay that had become his quarters. He had been feeling strange ever since his strength had returned, more agitated, more aware of the eyes on him. The crew still avoided him, save for Claire, but even she had seemed distant lately, preoccupied with other duties. Krav's enhanced hearing picked up the faint hum of the ship's systems, the distant chatter of the crew as they went about their work. But then, something else caught his attention, a sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder. The dull, rhythmic thud, like footsteps approaching. Instincts kicking in, Krav lowered his body, his muscles tensing as he moved silently toward the source of the sound. His mind flashed back to the war, to the times when he had hunted his enemies in the dead of night, stalking them through the wreckage of battlefields. But this wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't his enemies, were they? The footsteps grew louder, and then the door to the cargo bay slid open. Standing in the doorway was Sergeant Mason, his face a mask of suspicion and barely contained anger. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, but his hand hovered near the trigger. "What are you doing here?" Mason growled, his voice low and accusatory. "You think we don't know what you're up to? You're just biding your time, waiting for the right moment to turn on us." Krav didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the human before him. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, Krav's instincts screamed at him to attack, to defend himself. But he held back. He didn't want to fight. "What's the matter?" Mason taunted, taking a step closer. "Lost your nerve? Or maybe you're just waiting until the doc's not around to protect you." The insult stung, but not in the way Mason had intended. Krav had come to respect Claire, even in his own strange way. She had shown him kindness when no one else had, and now this human was throwing it back in his face. A low growl rumbled in Krav's throat, but he didn't move. "You're not fooling anyone, dog," Mason spat, his hand tightening on his rifle. "I don't care what Claire says. You're a killer, and it's only a matter of time before you prove me right." Krav's growl grew louder, his body coiling like a spring. The old instincts, the ones bred into him by the Orcs, flared to life. His muscles tensed, ready to strike. But just as the moment reached its breaking point, a voice cut through the tension. "Mason, stand down." Jace Harper's voice rang out like a shot, and Mason froze. The commander stepped into the cargo bay, his face grim. Behind him, Claire rushed in, her eyes wide with alarm. "What the hell is going on here?" Jace demanded, glaring at Mason. "I gave strict orders. No one is to approach Krav unless necessary." Mason's face twisted in frustration. "You're making a mistake, Commander. That thing's going to turn on us. You're just too blind to see it." Jace stepped forward, his voice dangerously low. "That's enough. You're off duty. Get out." For a moment, it looked like Mason might argue, but then he clenched his jaw and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. The tension in the cargo bay lingered long after he was gone. Claire hurried to Krav's side, her hands hovering over his tense form. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice filled with concern. Krav's growl faded, but his muscles remained tight. He didn't understand the words she spoke, but her tone was enough to calm him. Slowly, he relaxed, his eyes flicking toward the door where Mason had disappeared. For the first time since he had been brought aboard the Odyssey, Krav felt the weight of his past hanging over him like a shadow. No matter how much he tried to change, there would always be those who saw him as nothing more than a weapon. A killer. And maybe they were right. Days passed since the tense encounter between Surgeon Mason and Krav, but the lingering distrust between the crew and the war dog was palpable. Commander Jace Harper had done his best to calm the crew, emphasizing that Krav had given them no reason to fear him. But rumors had already started to spread, whispers among the crew about the war dog's true intentions. For Krav, the weight of those whispers was a constant pressure. He could feel the stares, hear the murmurs when he walked past. The humans who had once shown him kindness now seemed wary again, and it unsettled him. The only person who still treated him the same was Claire. But something inside Krav had begun to shift. His instincts, the ones he had fought so hard to suppress, were becoming louder. His body had fully healed, and with that recovery came the return of his predatory abilities. His senses were sharper, his reflexes faster. And with those abilities came the urge to act, to defend himself against the invisible threat he felt from the crew. In the middle of the night, Krav was awoken by a distant sound, an alarm. The low rhythmic hum of the Odyssey's alert system pulsed through the ship, sending a wave of tension through its corridors. Krav immediately rose to his feet, his ears pricked as he tried to make sense of the situation. Suddenly, the door to his quarters slid open, and Claire rushed in, her face pale with worry. "Krav, we have a problem," she said, her voice tight. "Pirates. They've boarded the ship." Pirates. The word meant little to Krav, but the urgency in Claire's voice was clear. His instincts flared. Danger was close. "Stay here," Claire ordered, moving toward the door. The crew can handle it. Just stay safe." But Krav didn't move. He could hear the distant sounds of gunfire now, the screams of the crew as they fought off the attackers. His heart raced, the familiar adrenaline of battle surging through him. His instincts screamed at him to join the fight, to protect his newfound pack, the humans. But Claire had told him to stay, to do nothing. He watched her disappear through the door, leaving him alone in the quiet of his quarters. But the silence didn't last long. The sound of footsteps, heavy, unfamiliar, echoed down the hallway outside. Krav's ears perked up. These weren't the footsteps of the crew. These were intruders. The door to his quarters slid open again. But this time, it wasn't Claire standing there. It was a group of heavily armed men, their faces masked, their weapons aimed directly at him. Instinct took over. With a low growl, Krav launched himself at the nearest attacker, his powerful body moving faster than the men could react. His jaws closed around the arm of the first man, and the sound of bones snapping filled the room. The others opened fire, but Krav was already moving, weaving through the gunfire with predatory precision. He was a weapon, after all. A perfect killing machine. Within moments, the intruders lay motionless on the floor, their blood pooling around them. Krav stood in the center of the carnage, his breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps. The old instincts had taken over completely. The human side of him, the side that had learned trust and compassion from Claire, was nowhere to be found. But before Krav could process what had just happened, more footsteps echoed down the hall. This time, it was the crew. Sergeant Mason was the first to arrive, his rifle drawn and his eyes wide with shock at the scene before him. "I knew it," he muttered under his breath. "I knew this thing would snap." Jace Harper followed close behind, his face a mask of disbelief. "Krav, what happened?" he asked, his voice firm, but laced with confusion. Krav didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. They thought he had turned on them. They thought he was a monster again, but he wasn't. He had defended them, protected them from the intruders. Why didn't they see that? Before Jace could say anything more, Claire pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes locking onto Krav. She saw the blood, the bodies, but there was no fear in her gaze. She moved toward him slowly, her hands raised in a calming gesture. "Krav," she whispered softly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's okay. You're safe. We're safe." Krav's body remained tense, but the sound of Claire's voice reached him, pulling him back from the edge. His breathing slowed, and he took a step back, his gaze shifting from the bodies on the floor to the humans around him. Claire placed a gentle hand on his side, her touch grounding him in the present. "You protected us," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You did what you had to do." Mason's voice cut through the moment, his tone harsh. "He's a killer, Commander. Look at him. You really think we can trust that thing?" Jace hesitated, his eyes flicking between Mason and Krav. But then he spoke, his voice resolute. "He saved us, Mason. If it weren't for him, those pirates would have taken the ship. Krav didn't turn on us. He defended us." Mason opened his mouth to argue, but Jace silenced him with a glare. "We owe him our lives." The crew, still tense, slowly began to lower their weapons. The tension in the room eased, and Krav, though still on edge, relaxed under Claire's calming touch. He had proven himself, not as a weapon, but as an ally. In the days following the pirate attack, the atmosphere aboard the Odyssey shifted. Krav, once viewed with suspicion, was now seen in a different light. He had saved the crew, risked his life to protect them, and in doing so, he had earned their respect. Even Sergeant Mason, though still wary, kept his distance, no longer openly questioning Krav's presence on the ship. The crew had come to accept him, and for the first time, Krav felt a sense of belonging that he had never known before. But with that acceptance came a new challenge. A question that hung heavy in the air. What was Krav's future? One evening, as the Odyssey sailed through the quiet vastness of space, Claire sat with Jace in the ship's observation deck, the stars twinkling beyond the viewport. They had been discussing Krav's progress, his place among the crew, and the possibility of what came next. "He can't stay on the ship forever," Jace said quietly, his gaze distant. "He's proven himself, but he's still different." Claire nodded, her heart heavy. "I know, but where does he go from here? He doesn't have a home. The Zorks abandoned him, and the galaxy doesn't know what to make of him." "Maybe that's up to him," Jace replied. "We've given him a chance to survive, but now it's time for him to decide his own fate." Krav stood at the edge of the Odyssey's cargo bay, looking out at the distant stars. For the first time in his life, the future felt uncertain, but it also felt like his own. No longer a tool of war, no longer bound by the orders of the Zorks, Krav was free. Claire approached him, standing beside him in the quiet of the cargo bay. "Where do you want to go, Krav?" she asked softly, though she knew he couldn't understand her words. "What do you want to do?" Krav didn't have an answer. He only knew that for the first time, his life was his own to choose, and as he looked out at the endless expanse of stars, he realized that the possibilities were as limitless as the galaxy itself. The war dog, once abandoned to die, had found his way back to life. And now, the universe was his to explore.